Well, let's talk more about all of this now with Firas, Maksad, an expert in US foreign policy and the Middle East. He's also an adjunct professor at George Washington University. Sir, a very warm welcome to the programme. Thank you very much for being with us. So we see this pattern, don't we? This renewed violence, the international outrage, and the one thing that seems to stay constant is the lack of progress.
That's correct, Julie, although I do think that we are potentially at a pivot point in the Syrian uprising or the Syrian civil war. This is in many ways an extension of the negotiation table that's taking place in Geneva and what's happening now in the battlefield of Aleppo. This is everybody's plan B. Nobody wanted to get here. Essentially, what happened in Geneva over the last couple of weeks is that the Syrian government, backed by Russia, tried to divert away from the Geneva Protocol, the Geneva parameters, which call for a transitional authority with full executive authority that would essentially not include President Assad. This is the Geneva framework. Instead, what the regime put forward is an amendment of a constitution and a government of national unity that would include the opposition. This was refused by the opposition. So as a result, we see now the commencing of this brutal military campaign by the Syrian government backed by Russian Air Force.
And Firas, what influence does the US wield right now? What can it do to hasten progress?
Frankly, Julie, the U.S. government is in a very embarrassing position. It is finding itself having to tell its allies, primarily the Turks, but also the Saudis, to some extent the Jordanians, that they need to hold the provision of weaponry to rebels, to anti-government rebels. But it's under a lot of pressure to provide more of that weaponry now that there's an offensive being launched by the Russians and by the Syrian government. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, spoke a couple of weeks ago about a plan B for Syria. Essentially, it was leaked here in Washington that the CIA has put together a plan to provide more advanced weaponry to the rebels should the cessation of hostilities fail. Those weaponries, we're told, might include anti-aircraft, therefore putting Russian aircrafts in danger. Anti-aircraft weapons, man-pads as they are known. Now, whether they will go ahead and do so, or whether President Putin and President Assad would have successfully called Washington's bluff, is something we'll all wait to find out in the next couple of days.
And Firas, you mentioned it in your original answer that we're at a pivotal moment. Are we going to see that pivotal moment play out, do you think, specifically in Aleppo over perhaps the next days and weeks to come?
Oh, very much so. I'm afraid there's no reprieve for the poor people stuck in Aleppo. I foresee hundreds of thousands of people perhaps making a rush for the Turkish border. Turkey will be under increased pressure to perhaps intervene in one way or another, especially if the Syrian government forces backed by Iranian forces and militias and the Russian Air Force successfully lay siege to the city and then proceed to cut off the supply route from Aleppo running north into the Turkish border. That really will be a game changer for the Turks, but also for the other regional powers that are supporting the rebel forces in the city. So I'm afraid that this is only about to get worse if we continue on the path that we're on.
Firas Maksad there joining me live from Washington, D.C. Sir, thank you very much for joining us.